Episode 2, Gore, not named for the upcoming violence, but Lieutenant, or Commander Graham Gore. He was a lieutenant when the expedition sailed, but is referred to as the late Commander Gore on the Victory Point message, the last official communication we have from the expedition. So general consensus is that Franklin probably gave him a field promotion before they both died. Gore had travelled inland onto King William Island long before the start of the march south, so it's possible that he did something impressive while he was away. Maybe even found the Northwest Passage. We don't know. Of course, it's also possible that Fitzjames, who wrote the message, got his rank wrong. He got the year wrong, twice, and lead addles the mind. We open a year after episode 1 ended with the expedition cat. In episode 3, Franklin calls it Fagin, but we don't know what it was called in real life. No one ever made a record of it. Here are Harry Pegler and John Bridgens. In the book and the show, they're a couple. This is based on the fact that a skeleton was found carrying papers belonging to Pegler. It's commonly believed that skeleton was Bridgens. Dan Simmons came up with everything else. In the book and the show, Bridgens was an older man, Pegler's superior. He's teaching Pegler how to read, feeding him books by Shakespeare and Herodotus from the ship's library. In real life, Bridgens was in his 20s, Pegler was 10 years older, and a superior officer. Still, the possibility for relationships aboard ship was very real, even if it was a crime punishable by flogging, or worse. Sled parties are being sent from the ships in the hope of finding open water. Gore is being sent onto King William Island to try and find message cairns built by previous explorers. Message cairns were man-made piles of rock where travellers would leave messages for those who came after them. In the Victory Point message, they mention having trouble finding a couple of previous cairns, and having to build a couple of their own. Though, in the show, they find them just fine. You see, these were not the first white men to visit King William Island. Previous expeditions had mostly come overland. And who built one of the cairns Gore was searching for? Sir James Clark Ross, Crozier's best friend and probably the greatest polar explorer of the early Victorian era. One of the many reasons the expedition would probably have been better off with him at the helm.
Be sure to come back with a story.
Joyfully, sir.
I only wish I could join in the outing.
There's another Franklin expedition novel called The Broken Lands where he does just that. It's an interesting and non-supernatural version of the story that you should read if you don't mind them getting a lot of basic history wrong, like having Commander Gore survive right to the end. It's odd that the teams sent out are pulling boats. They weren't expecting long journeys or to sail in any open water they found. Actual sled parties would probably have used sledges as lightweight as possible and filled them with a few days' supplies. Man-hauling the boats is just wasting energy. Gore is among the men hauling the boat. As an officer, it's very unlikely that he would have done that unless things got desperate, like on the march south. One of the show's biggest problems is the frequent lack of warm breath in the air. It kind of ruins the illusion that it's the Arctic. The north side of King William Island itself is very accurately recreated. It's desolate, rocky and cold. Franklin visits Crozier on the Terror, complaining about losing his company in the previous year. Obviously, this is conjecture, but Crozier complained in his letters that Franklin would demand he visit Erebus for dinner most nights. He didn't like to leave Terror or socialize. He was there to do a job. Franklin, in his letters, didn't seem to realize Crozier's irritation. These letters were sent from Greenland, the last stop before they vanished. Now, about Crozier's alcoholism, I've not been able to find anything authoritative about how much drinking he actually did. He was an alcoholic in the book, probably because it went well with him being depressive, which he was, and because it played off well with Sir John Franklin being a teetotaler, which he was.
Sir, he was no one's first choice for this expedition.
Nor was I.
Both of these things are true. There were a lot of men ahead of both Crozier and Franklin. Hell, Fitzjames was considered for command at one point. One of the Admiralty actually pushed for Crozier to be given full command. And bizarrely, it wasn't Sir James Clark Ross. But he was voted down, and it looked like Crozier wouldn't be involved. Crozier didn't want to do second in command. He'd done that, and if Ross wasn't in command, he didn't want to do it again. But after an impromptu tour around Europe, that he embarked on without telling his closest friends, he sent a letter of application to Captain the Terror and was accepted. Exactly why he did this isn't precisely known, but I suspect he might have sought to impress Franklin's niece Sophia Cracroft, who had just turned him down for marriage. The show takes a different view in a flashback, one that I'd not thought of and is frankly brilliant. You see, in real life, Sophia refused Crozier's hand in marriage twice, saying that she'd seen how being married to a Navy man affected Lady Jane Franklin. But in the show, it's because the Franklins told her to.
He proposed. Again.
You declined, of course.
Not firmly enough.
Whether it's because of anti-Irish bigotry, or because he wasn't upper class, or out of a legit attempt to save her from worry, or something else entirely, is left a bit ambiguous. Now, until evidence appears that something like this happened, I'm going to take Sophia's word for her reasons. But it's plausible. The Franklins were Sophia's guardians, and women didn't exactly have much say in their own lives. This is different from the book, where Sophia is basically playing with Crozier's affections because she likes the attention. And to make it even more muddled, Lady Jane Franklin claimed that Crozier's affection for Sophia was entirely one-sided, and she only had eyes for James Clark Ross. Though, to be fair, everyone had eyes for James Clark Ross.
He's suitable for a good many women, but under a different banner than ours.
In the show, this is the reason for Crozier's distance from Franklin, but nothing like this is even suggested in his letters. Anyway, in the show, why did he go? Sophia asked him to look after her beloved Uncle John. She knew Crozier was a far better sailor than him, and he loved her, so he went. Anyway, how about something definite? Neither Crozier nor Franklin smoked, regardless of what these shots think. Lieutenant Irving finds Cornelius Hickey and William Gibson having sex down below. There's no evidence that either of these men were gay or bi in real life. This is a slight difference from the book, where Hickey is having sex with a crewman called Magnus Manson, who's depicted as a giant with the mind of a child. Manson is still around in the show, he's just not having sex with Hickey. And in real life, we know almost nothing about Manson. He was 28, he was from Southend, and was an able seaman. Was he actually big? Was he special needs? Did he get taken advantage of? Maybe, but probably not. As with the book, Hickey's the villain. In the show, he's less obviously evil, though. In the early episodes, he's clearly not a good guy, but it's only very late in the series that he turns into the monster that he was the whole time in the book. Dan Simmons' Hickey is anything but subtle. He's basically a murderous Silver Age supervillain with a vague rat theme. Someone as ugly on the outside as he is on the inside. We know almost nothing about the real-life Cornelius Hickey. He was from Limerick, was in his early 20s, and he carved his name on a knife found where he likely starved to death with his crewmates. I feel uncomfortable with what the book did to him, but later on the show adds a twist that makes it a bit better. When the sled parties return, they report problems with the provisions. Goldner, who made the canned food taken on the expedition, had a habit of underbidding and doing very shoddy work. Cans filled with rotten food, chunks of bone not full, some with rocks inside, botulism, and as discovered way too late to help the crew, lead solder leaching into the food. Ice Master Blanky of the Terror and Crozier discuss an earlier expedition under William Parry, one of the earliest important British Arctic explorers, where they tried to use reindeer to haul supplies and it was a disaster. They're discussing the 1827 attempt on the North Pole that they both took part in. Crozier's the guy waving in this picture. Thanks to that expedition, Parry held the furthest north record for 49 years. As the name suggests, Ice Masters are basically the ship's resident ice experts. Blanky had a long and very cold career. He'd been a merchant captain, reached the North Magnetic Pole, had spent almost 20 years in the Arctic, and survived a starvation march. In his last words home, he warned that regardless of the Navy's confidence, the expedition may take as many as 5 or 7 years to return home, which is a way more accurate prediction than most people gave. Hickey and Crozier discussed the anti-Irish bigotry in the Victorian Navy. Now, some people born in Ireland did very well in the British military, men like Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, but as Irish statesman Daniel O'Connell said about him, just because he was born in a stable does not make him a horse. There was a difference between the Anglo-Irish, noble families who held lands in Ireland and were treated as essentially English, and commoner Irish, like Crozier and the real Hickey. Now, Crozier came from one of the richest families in the town of Banbridge. The house he was born in still stands. It's opposite the church his family paid for. It's right by his monument. But an upper middle class Irishman was considered Irish, while someone like Wellesley was considered basically English. Just born in a stable. Like Jesus. Crozier's career did suffer because of anti-Irish bigotry. It's one of the reasons he never got the fame or riches of his peers. And why Fitzjames was often treated as the second in command of the expedition. He chose the crew. He did the scientific work. Both jobs the second in command was supposed to be in charge of. And both jobs Crozier was experienced at. I mean, Crozier was a member of the Royal Geographical Society because of his scientific work with polar magnetism. Now, I don't want to give too simplified a view. Of course Crozier was treated better than a man like Hickey. He was an officer, he was from money, he was Protestant, though not Church of England, and he was of English ancestry, though some generations back. But he was definitely either on the high end of the low end of the heap, or on the low end of the high end of the heap. Socially and professionally, he'd hit a green glass ceiling. After being harassed by the Tumbak, mistaking it for a bear, Gore's men accidentally shoot the shaman that kinda controls it. Because he appeared to David Young in a vision, I'm thinking he was coming to warn the crews to leave the area before the Tumbak started eating them. That went well. Commander Gore is the first of the crews to be killed by the Tumbak. The shaman is brought on board, and Stanley, the senior doctor in the Erebus, who in real life was a little younger than in the show, is against even trying to save his life. In the book, that bigotry mainly came from Franklin. I've seen no evidence that either Franklin or Stanley was unusually racist against the Inuit for their day, but information on Stanley is fairly spotty. From what I've read, I'm very doubtful that the real Franklin would have reacted anything like that. Now, in these videos, I've been using the terms doctor and surgeon interchangeably, mainly for simplicity's sake, but at the time they were not treated the same. The doctor outranked the surgeon, who was seen as more of a medical technician. Stanley's a doctor, while Goodsir, who accompanied Gore and tried to save the shaman, is a surgeon. The shaman's daughter, Lady Silence, was nicknamed that because in the book she had no tongue. Unlike in real life, Crozier speaks Inuit. I believe the exact language is Netsilik. The shaman dies, the Lady Silence can't control the Tumbak as well as her father, or at all, and to make matters worse, the crew stuff his dead body into an ice hole, instead of honouring his people's funerary traditions. It's like they want the Tumbak to kill them all. Lady Silence's real name is Silna, and this scene would be a bit more complicated if, like in the book, she didn't have a tongue.
She said that if we don't leave now, we're going to Hukahoy.
Disappear.
After the shaman dies, the sled party are questioned about what happened out there. In a nice bit of realism, Fitzjames is interested in Gore. He knew Gore. He got him the posting. While Crozier is interested in finding out if they found open water. He's practical. He realises there's no chance Gore survived the attack. And he knows that open water is more important than any of their lives. Okay, random historical note, but halfway through, Franklin watches some of his men play football. We don't see much of the match, but there seems to be a goalkeeper. I'm no expert in football, but I don't think dedicated goalkeepers were introduced until a few decades later. The whole game at that point was a set of competing rules that different groups used, so maybe their version had them.